So anyone that knows me knows that I love to read. Mostly history. It's actually an obsession. But I love to read in general. I love hard copy books. I love the feeling of just moving the pages. I love making notes. I love reading books. It's hard to believe in 2025 of a location not having books or having a library available. But in this story, it's a story of a group of folks after the Civil War that tried to start a very small library in the historic town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. And their story started in 1877 and ended around 1949. And even though their library ended up shutting down and moving towards a larger library system that could serve more of the community, and is actually a very successful library system today, their story is virtually unknown. So here's their story. Hey, this is Sarah, and you're listening to another episode on Ladies First, Not Really. It was 1877, 13 years after the Civil War ended. Fredericksburg was hit hard during the war, and it took a long time for them to rebuild. So a group of folks decided to organize the Fredericksburg Library and Lyceum Association with the goal to create the city's first library and offer public programs. Now, if you didn't know what a lyceum was, like I didn't, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it is a group or venue that offers public lectures and entertainment. The association's board of trustees consisted of 7 men, a Reverend James P. Smith, ex-Lieutenant Governor John L. Maury, J. N. Barney, Elliot M. Braxton, P.V.D. Conway, Reverend T. L. Dunaway, and Robert Hall. The Lyceum operated for a while but eventually closed. Having no state or city funding, the library operated solely on subscriptions that paid for tickets to borrow the books and donations. This library offered books to residents within and outside the city limits, which was a contrast to most area libraries that only offered services to the residents. Relying on subscriptions was a constant issue for this small library, and in 1887 they did not have sufficient funding to employ a librarian, so the books were boxed up and housed at the YMCA. But in 1894, 8 local women appealed to the 3 remaining trustees and requested to take over the books to reopen the library in the city courthouse, which was the Fredericksburg Historic Courthouse, which is now City Hall. They were granted permission and secured 2 rooms in the lower level of the courthouse, 1 for books and 1 for reading. The 8 women who took on this task are worth naming here because their endeavors carried the library for several decades. Mrs. V. M. Fleming, Mrs. Marshall Hall, Mrs. J. Fred Brown, Miss Gravitt, Meyer, Schooler, Carson, and Barnev. Unfortunately, name formalities prevent us from knowing their first names because every woman was either known as Miss somebody or Mrs. their husband's first name. Currently, they had about 1,000 volumes to offer the community. And so the library reopened January 10th of 1895. Now in 1905, a man named C. Wister Wallace had died and willed $15,000 for the Wallace Library to be built there in the town. This was for a local library, and the city and a committee was formed. On May 20th of 1909, the Wallace Library Committee, made up of all men, by the way, posted a note to the Fredericksburg Library Board, who were all women, stating they believed there should be only one library, obviously the Wallace Library, and recommended the women of the Fredericksburg Library to turn over titles of the books that they have so that the Wallace Library wouldn't waste funds in purchasing duplicate books. In other words, this group of prominent men decided the small library and the women who volunteered their time to serve this community should basically give up their inventory and shut the doors because there should only be one library and it should not be theirs. Now, the women's reply provided the argument for 2 libraries since theirs served those who were city residents and external. The Wallace Library would only serve those within the limits of the city. Their intentions were made clear. They were resolved to stand strong and not to fall to intimidation. Both libraries continued to operate for several decades. The Wallace Library had more funding, space, more open hours, and better offerings, and so became very popular. In 1910, they opened in the building that was adjacent to the courthouse. So the Fredericksburg Library was in the historic courthouse. The Wallace Library was literally the building to the left of it. In 1927, the Fredericksburg Library celebrated its 50th anniversary of service and hosted a tea fundraiser. In 1935, the Library Committee ran an article in the Freelance Star newspaper to raise awareness of its location and invite folks to join. The library was open on Tuesdays and Saturdays from 3:30 to 5:50, and to check out books, members purchased a ticket for $1.50. This ticket allowed the borrowing of 4 books per week. Unfortunately, the lack of funding and growing popularity of the Wallace Library sealed the fate of this small, modest library. It's unclear exactly when the library closed, but on January 15th in 1949, the Freelance Star reported the Wallace Library had obtained books from a private subscription library which formerly was located in the courthouse. So the story of this small library group of women and their sheer determination to stand up to deep pockets and expansion was carried away in the wind of Fredericksburg's history. This story is mostly unknown and has been absorbed into the current Fredericksburg Library system, but it is not a part of the system's story. It stands on its own, just like the women who saved it in 1894 and served their community for the next 55 years. For more information, visit my blog at rebelliouscorsets.com.